Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your protein-based lunch and are feeling energized by what you have eaten for the discussions this afternoon. So this morning, we focused on hearing about the results of the Protein2Food project, those findings, key ingredients, key products, and we began to discuss some of the challenges, how do we build on that progress to date from the scientific perspective, from a technical perspective, and from a broader economic, societal perspective as well. In a moment, we're going to have a stakeholder panel. So we're going to build on that by talking about the way forward. What are the key challenges in order to accelerate the protein transition? What are the policy priorities? Where do we need to go in terms of financing and policy in order to build on the work of the Project 8? But before we do that, I would like to get a little snapshot of your opinions to feed into our discussion. So can I ask you to take your smartphone, smart tablet, whatever device you use, if indeed you have one, let's not assume that everybody is coming equipped, but if you have one, could you take it in hand and could you put into your search engine slido.com or sli.do, either will work, S-L-I-D-O. And when you've done that, you type in hashtag protein. So, Slido, Sly and Dough, or slido.com, and then hashtag protein. When everybody's ready, when you've done that, look at me and I'll know you're there. And so everyone's not going, all right, I'm not there, don't look at her. So, I say, just want to get your opinion. 2 questions which can really help and inform the discussion that I'm going to have with our panel in a moment, and again with all of you, because this will be an entirely interactive panel. So I'm going to have some questions for them, and then, as we did this morning, I'd love to hear from all of you, not just with questions, but with comments. But if you are ready, let's have the first question. So, now I realize that you're going to say, I can't answer this question because I want to tick all of them. But we're prioritizing here. So what do you see as the most important driver for the protein transition? I pick the one that you think will have the most impact. Is it money? We talked about incentives this morning. We didn't talk about taxation as a possible incentive, but financial incentives. Is it less related to money or more to policy incentives that foster technical and social innovation, building that innovation ecosystem, setting binding thresholds and so on? Is it financial or policy? Is it focusing very specifically on the farmers? We heard about the pressures on their livelihoods. We heard about some of the challenges for them in terms of profit margins and so on. Is it supporting them with money, with advice, with upskilling or whatever to grow the crops? Is it support for industry to develop new products and indeed linked to that the new processes, those optimized processes we were talking about this morning? Is it public sector procurement? Let me give you an example. So you might, for example, set a percentage in provision of food acquired through public procurement, a percentage that must be protein-based. Is that, for you, the most useful tool? Or is it to focus really on the consumers, on their behavior and on their choices above all else? So, I realize, as I say, the answer is all of the above, but pick what you think would have the most impact. As far as I can see, no one's voted yet, unless that little timer isn't working. Then I can't, then it's not telling me anything. Okay. Give it another 10, 20 seconds? Yes. Hashtag protein. Hashtag protein. It doesn't, I think, has it? Some people have managed to join. Yes, sorry. On your screen, you will see underneath the title of it, it says Q&A or polls. You need to click on the one that says polls. Doesn't, oh, I think it's Thank you very much for that. That was very helpful. Have most of you managed to get in? Very good. How many have voted? 50. Okay. Okay, and you can, if those of you fail to vote, you can always express your opinions during our discussion with the panel. So let's have a look at the replies to that question. Very interesting. So I can't see what the percentage is on the end of there because we have a little bit of, what's the percentage on changing consumers? Can you on your phone see it? 57. 57. Okay, very good. So 57% of you really focusing there on the consumer. It did feature a lot in our conversation this morning. I imagine we will come back to it in our panel now. Then fairly equally divided on the policy incentives. Interestingly, many more of you focusing on policy than on money, than on financing. 15% on the policy, only 6% on the financial incentives. And that support, going back to Udo's points this morning, and indeed to Nick's about the pressure on livelihood, seen as very important as well. Less about support for industry, and only a tiny proportion thinking public procurement really, bearing in mind, of course, we are talking about the most impact. So that doesn't rule those out at all. Let us come to the second question, and this is really where I want your assessment of the state of play, which will tell us how big the challenge is for the future. Is Europe on track to deliver the protein transition? Yes, it has the right policies in place to accelerate progress. Partly, it's got some of the right policies, but there are gaps. Progress is just too slow. Or no, it's not got it right at all and really needs to move up a gear to make the necessary progress. So are we doing the right things to get there? Are we doing some of the right things, or are we really not doing the right things at all? Particularly with that emphasis on the speed, the accelerating progress that we have been underlining the importance of all day. So, how are we doing on the numbers voting? Simpler one, this one. 36, 38. Okay, going up nicely. So we'll just give it another second or two. And if you are all done, let's have a look at the results of that second vote. Okay, so I'm guessing about 53% as we are at 0 and 48, 52, my maths is good. So that's interesting. Okay, so nobody so far thinks we're doing all the right things and we just have to implement them. And then you're very evenly split, and it's a lot of you, nearly half of you, 47% no. We really need to be much more radical if we're going to get there. So fascinating stuff. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate that. And as I say, I will feed your answers into the discussion with our panel. So you can relax for the moment, but not for too long, because I do hope you will join our debate later on. So let me bring up our panel. There are some steps there, which is slightly easier than what I just did. Let me introduce our panel and bring them up on stage. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dr. Pablo Steinberg, President of the Max Rubner-Institute, the Federal Research Institute of Nutrition and Food. Come and join me, Pablo. Ricardo Siligato, you heard from him from the audience this morning, policy advisor at Copa-Cogeca, represents the farmers, of course, and he's policy advisor for food safety, human and animal nutrition, information to consumers, quality assurance and promotion policy. You're a busy man, Ricardo. So very much to those topics we were talking about this morning, and very much to your priorities in terms of future work. You heard it from him again from the audience this morning. Carol van Bommel, Market Officer in the Arable Crops and Olive Oil Unit in the Directorate General for Agriculture and Rural Development in the Commission. Carol, thank you so much for being with us. And last but not least, Jorian Peters, Process Technologist at the Vegetarian Butcher. Jorian, I hope you will tell us a little more. I read about the Vegetarian Butcher, but I'll leave it to you to explain to people what it is, perhaps in answer to my first question. So, as I said before, this panel, we're not going to make opening remarks. We have nothing to present. We want to talk about the way forward. Where do we go from here? So I will ask them a few questions, and then I will come out to all of you for your questions. And as I said this morning, also your comments are very welcome indeed. But Pablo, maybe I could start with you. We heard this morning from people who've been involved in the project how they saw the challenge ahead in their specific areas. But more broadly, if we're going to accelerate the transition, how do you see the challenge ahead?
Well, the problem we have is we know what the consumer should do, but the consumers do not do what we think they should do. That's the greatest problem. And that's why when you asked about what is the main driver, in only milliseconds, I wrote down the consumer education button. I think we have to start with the most young people in our society, and I think we have to start with children to educate them about the principles we have heard this morning and we will discuss this afternoon. And the difficulty we have, there is not the consumer. I come from a country, an industrialized nation from Germany, but 20 to 25% of the population earns about 800 euros a month. That means they cannot afford to buy expensive foods. So it's about the prices of the food. And I live in a country where over many years, the cheap choice was the sexy choice, and it is today. And this is one, I think, the big issues which we have to discuss this afternoon. There are many others, but I'll let it with that.
And for you, the key reason why they're not, we know what, as you say, we know what they should do, but they're not. The key reason for you is cost.
It's one of the main drivers.
One of the main drivers.
And one point that nobody addressed this morning really in detail was, and there are the words, sustain human health. If we are going to make that to an argument, to have a healthier choice, then we have to explain the population why these crops and the products you want to bring into the market are those that will sustain human health. Because I will be very provocative. The vegetarians which we have in Germany are most of the time healthy. So what's the argument to switch to the new crops? Do we need more protein? I would be again provocative. I will tell you as a nutritional physiologist, we have an excess of protein in our diets. We don't need more protein. So how are you going to transmit to the population that you will have new crops which are protein rich? What's the issue? Is it protein quality, I heard this morning? And those are the difficult points you have to transmit.
And then, but you were talking then, of course, about vegetarian, so we're also talking about the switch from animal protein to plant protein. So you're talking about the people who've already made the switch.
Make it very easy, again provocative. We don't need a whole population of vegetarians. Okay. What I'm saying as a president of a Federal Research Institute of Food and Nutrition in Germany is we should have a basic vegetarian diet with a small amount of meat. And then we should speak about what is the quality of the meat. And when I say a small amount, I make numbers. 500 to 600 grams per week, not more than that. And there is also poultry, and there is also fish, which you could discover. That is for Germany.
Lots to talk about. Thank you very much for that, Ricardo. What for you, you talked this morning about a concern that the narrative might be a bit simplistic. Let's complexicize it, as it is. It's complex. I don't think complexicize is a word, but I quite like it, so I'm sticking with it. And did that link to the way, if you voted on my first question, does your perception of the challenges also influence how you voted on drivers for change?
Well, I will say that currently it's quite challenging to convince young people to become a farmer. This is the most important problem nowadays. There are many problems, for example, access to land, first of all, incentives. So what I voted was support in general, from a broad perspective, to the farming community. Besides support, we also need innovation. This is very important. We need financial, we need economical, and we need a social and a technological support. All this is very important to convince also farmers, if needed, to switch to grow additional crops.
For you, I'm interested that you're pointing at the younger generation. Is that because you think younger generations of farmers, A, it's important for the sector generally, but are more likely to be open to this switching to producing more proteins, to making Europe more self-sufficient in this area?
I think in general it will be easier for a farmer who is just starting their own business to align with the market. So the farming community is always delivering what the market is requesting, what consumers are requesting. And of course, if you have been growing, I don't know, wheat for 20 years, you know some practices, for example, it's quite difficult then to change to another crop. But if you start your business by scratch, then it's much easier. Because anyway, you need to study and you need to develop your own crop field. So you are going to grow what the consumers are willing to take.
We'll come back on that support to farmers and what it needs to look like and what more we need to do a little bit later on. But let's continue to build our picture of most important challenges. Carol, from your point of view as a policymaker, what for you is I mean, it doesn't have to be one here, a range of key challenges. What would you particularly highlight? And how did you vote on my driver question, if you voted?
There are many challenges, and I would like to highlight 4 challenges. First of all, breeding. Protein crops are in general minor crops which lack sources, financial resources for breeding, and they need more yield stability and also higher yields. This was presented also as the most important topic in a stakeholder survey that we held in 2018 as preparation to our report on plant proteins. And also because it needs to be financially interesting for farmers to grow pulses, to incorporate it in their crop rotation. And for that, it was also mentioned this morning, the farmers need knowledge, farm advisory, innovation, partnerships, those kind of things to improve the knowledge again of maybe the lost knowledge of growing pulses. And another point, challenge is that the supply chain, because farmers, before they want to incorporate those crops, they need to know that there's a market for their products. But also, on the other hand, if a food producer wants to start a new product line, they need to know that there's sufficient supply. So they need both commitment for their long-term investments. And that is often considered a bottleneck at the moment. And then, of course, there's the consumer demand and research, which is generally needed to improve plant protein.
Lots to come back to in our discussion. Joren, tell everyone a little bit more about the vegetarian butcher and the work that you've been doing. We had a long debate this morning about meat substitutes or new innovative products. So tell us a little bit about your work and the key challenges you see it now to increase the demand for, the take-up of products like yours and get many more people doing what you're doing.
Yeah, so the Vegetarian Butcher started a little bit more than 10 years ago. It was founded by Jaap Korteweg, who is a farmer. And at the moment there was problems with the flu for pigs. And then the government came to him and asked if he could store the dead pigs at his farm. And then he was thinking about, okay, should I do that or not? And he decided he wouldn't like to do it. And that also taught him to think a little bit more about what he was eating and what he was farming. So then he decided he would like to become a vegetarian. And he tried it by going on easy and decided to use or to eat vegetarian at his home and not when he went out. But what he discovered was actually that he went out more often to eat meat. So that's why I thought, okay, I have to come up with something else. I like meat a lot. And to be able to eat less meat, I would like to have a good substitute. So in taste, in texture, all things like that. And that's how he just came up with making that bigger. He started the company, the Vegetarian Butcher, really as a small company making products which should mimic meat on all its aspects. And last year we were taken over by Unilever with the whole idea to make the Vegetarian Butcher the biggest butcher of the world. So really show everyone to eat less meat and go for a meat substitute.
And the key challenge in order to achieve that goal, to get that switch in behavior, what for you is are the most important challenges?
I think you have to show the consumer really that it is a good product. What we do a lot is go outside, let consumers just perceive a piece, don't tell them that it is no meat, and then they really see, it tastes like meat, and they like it. And to advocate it a lot like that, we see that consumers are more and more willing to eat vegetarian products.
So, building on Pablo's thing about the cheap product used to be the sexy product, the yummy product, the good tasting product is also the good choice. So making it easy, convenient, to be able to make that switch. How did you vote? Did you therefore focus, in my first question, on changing consumer behavior as the key driver?
Yeah, that's what it is.
And Carol, I didn't ask you, which did you choose as the key driver? Speaking as a policy maker, I'm wondering if you're among the 15% who said policy incentives, or...
I was among those 15%. On the first hand, I had chosen the consumer, but as the consumer is quite difficult to change, I chose the policy side.
Okay. And can I ask, I won't ask you this first, but in my second question, when I asked the room, are we on the right track to deliver and deliver at the rate we need to, no one thought we were absolutely on the right track. Half the room thought, no, we really needed to do something quite radical. Half said, we're partly getting there. Again, same question as before to you all. Joren, how did you vote on that one?
I think we are partly on the good way. It's more and more advocating at in lots of ways to eat more plant-based products. But I think, the change has to go further than that. I agree that we most likely have to start with young children. Those you can influence much easier than adults, and in that way try to get the next generation into those plant products.
Thank you. And Carol, how did you mark your own homework? Did you give yourself some gold? No, well, you didn't, clearly.
No.
Not even you said we were on the right track and doing all the right things.
Of course not. Otherwise, I could relax here. No, there's. I think we are partly on the right track. You see, for example, that the area of pulses has doubled since 2013 in Europe. You see that the consumer behavior is changing. You see the meat and dairy alternatives market growing with double digits every year. So, for example, it is outside of my area, but for example in Canada you see that pulses in the dietary advices are in the same category as meat and dairy. And that makes consumers more aware. Those consumer advices are national responsibility, so therefore it is out of our scope, but those are things that could help, I think.
Thank you, and I was quite struck, but we'll come back to it, about the fact that many more people, traditionally in Brussels, people tend to say it's all about the money, it's all about the financial incentives and so on, much more emphasis here on the policy side. But Ricardo, how did you vote on that second question? Partly or not at all?
Not at all. I was quite negative because I experienced directly all the problems that the farming sector have in this moment. For example, there are many farmers which are disappearing, for example, so we are closing businesses. And something that we have to avoid is to shift the agricultural production outside the EU. Yeah. So we have to continue to maintain our agriculture because, as I said in the morning, we have the best standards in the world. And I think consumers want a product that is the most sustainable out there. Something that is also very important is that, for example, new breeding techniques, maybe it was not mentioned so much this morning, but we need to have better genetic materials. And after the Court of Justice, the decision from 2018, there is a problem also. I think we are aligned together with the scientific community when we say that we need to develop and to use new breeding techniques to have better varieties for climate change, for pests and diseases, and also to increase the nutritional content. And the third reason, I was also quite negative because 40 million of Europeans suffer from food insecurity. So when we say that, there is an excess of proteins for more than 90% of the European population, yes, but there is 8% of Europeans that do not eat enough animal and plant proteins. Animal proteins are also very important for human health. We should never forget that.
Okay. Thank you. So Pablo, we have 2 glass half full, 1 glass less than half empty. Where did you stand on that second question?
I said no.
You said no as well. Yeah. Why did you say no?
We have to do much more than we have done up to now.
Can you hold the mic up a bit?
And one word or 2 words that haven't come up yet in the discussion is, it's not only consumer behavior, it's the consumer competence in cooking and doing something with the food we buy. And we are seeing that this is getting lost. We are at a state, 2020, where life is going very quickly, very fast. We have convenience food everywhere, and we are losing this competence. I'm not saying that we can do that. I'm one that works perhaps 12 hours a day and comes in the evening, and we have to cook with my wife. We don't do that in the way we should do it every day, so I'm not a saint. But I think we have to start again with the very young to bring up this or bring over this competence. I think that is an important point besides the consumer behavior stuff.
And I think you were all here this morning listening to the presentations, and you're all familiar with the Protein2Food project. How important do you think is the sort of work that's been done under this project and some of the issues that they have raised and explored and come up with we saw some very interesting results this morning. How important is that sort of work if we are to get more of the right answers? Because, I mean, Ricardo, you talked about a simplistic narrative. I think, can you explain a little bit more what you meant by that? But nevertheless, within that narrative, we heard some very specific and concrete examples of progress being made and problems being identified.
Yes, thank you. In general, I think that the livestock production has been pictured in a very negative way this morning. This is my feeling, and which is not the case in Europe, at least. As I said this morning, we have really increased the productivity in Europe, and we have decreased the greenhouse gas emissions. There is a lot of research, for example, for cows to decrease the methane production and the fermentation processes and the production of greenhouse gases. So the solution is not the disappearance of the livestock sector. The solution is the adaptation of the livestock sector, because we have to always keep in mind that through the human history, livestock has been always a very important source of proteins for human beings. In the mountains, where often you cannot grow many crops, you have goats and sheep that can provide very high quality food products to the people living there.
So it's a balance. We need to get, what you're really saying is, yes, these sorts of initiatives, this sort of projects are very good, but we need to get that balance. Carol, for you, in terms of the importance of Protein2Food and other similar projects, how can that help to meet some of the challenges we're talking about? How important do you think it's been so far?
I think it is very important. What I like about this project is that it is from crop production to prototypes for food. That is actually the key, because changes you have to make together. The innovation you need to grow a crop which there's demand for in a food product in the end. So I think those are valuable items of research like this project. And for example, also that different varieties in different regions. Europe is not is quite vast, and it is not one silver bullet. This crop will fit everywhere in Europe. It requires different protein crops, and also you have different consumers. Somebody from the north is quite different than somebody from the Mediterranean. So those are things to take into account. And last thing that I would like to mention, I think it is good, the initiative to also try to calculate the life cycle analysis, the impact. I realize that it is quite difficult work, and I think there more work could be done also to make it understandable for the consumer when he wants to get a sustainable product.
Thank you. In terms of the work done by the project, I don't know, were you familiar with it already, the work they're doing, or were you listening, Jorian, for the first time? How important do you think these sorts of projects are in terms of feeding into the sort of work you're doing at the commercial end of the chain?
I think it's very relevant. We want to make good meat alternatives. So the proteins which we are looking for should have certain properties, and it's good to investigate which kind of proteins we can use, which one are the most sustainable to use. So in the end we can give the consumer a really healthiest, sustainable alternative.
And if I might ask, is that part of when you're working, is it really to come up with, is the focus very much on commercial alternatives, or are you doing that more in-depth research into which ones are best, which ones, and processes and so on? Are you looking at all those elements of the equation?
Now we are taken over by Unilever. There are a lot of more researchers involved, and so we are also looking for the best alternatives in any way. Yeah.
So a really important part of the work. Pablo, your feeling listening to the presentations this morning and the contribution that this project has made?
Well, first of all, I have to congratulate the colleagues to the excellent work they have been doing. For the future, there were only 2 times there were wordings that came up, but they didn't look at, perhaps because of the short time they had. And this is the aspect of consumer education and what I said before. What are the advantages in terms of human health being increased? And I didn't hear much of that. And especially, and I'm again provocative, we don't have a deficiency in nutrients, as I think Emanuele said. We have enough of that besides iodine, folic acid, and vitamin D3. Those are the problems in Germany, but we don't have generally a deficiency in nutrients. That is a thing we shouldn't use. If you're speaking of nutritional physiology, perhaps he's got another point there. But I think those are the most important things. But I looked very carefully at what they were presenting, and I have to say that you're doing a highly processing of food and materials. And you should know that in the scientific literature, there's a long and controversial debate if ultra-processed food, as it is named in the literature, is really healthier than processed or less processed food. And that is an aspect when you're going to speak about increasing human health in the future, you will have to take that into account in the discussion, because there are quite a number of researchers, I'm not saying myself, but are saying the more you process the food and food materials, the unhealthier it's going to be. It's simply for the discussion in a few minutes.
Absolutely. Just before we start to delve into some of these areas, and I want to come back on all of them, the type of support for farmers that is really needed, how we get this consumer education right, how we support the research and innovation and the industrial innovation. But before we do that, just in terms of a broad, effective strategy, can I ask you, and after this I'll come out to all of you before we delve in more detail, I was quite struck by the replies to the question about drivers, because as I say, relatively few focusing on the financial side of it, that we need financial incentives to change farmers' practices, consumers' behaviors, industrial processes, many more choosing policy incentives. And I wonder whether you would share that analysis, that it's much more about the enabling conditions that we create than it is about public money. And really, if we can identify, this morning there was a lot of emphasis on we have to be holistic. It's not just environmental sustainability, it's economic and social sustainability. Whether you would, what a holistic approach really looks like. So anybody particularly surprised about this policy versus financial incentives thing? Ricardo, did that strike you as surprising or logical?
No, it's quite logical, I think, because financial support is just one of the many supports that farmers need. Also, social support and technological support, as I mentioned before. So we really need to include all these three different aspects in order to adapt the agriculture to the needs of the future world. The agriculture that we have nowadays is not the agriculture that there was 20 years ago. Agriculture and farmers are continuously adapting to what the market and the consumers are requesting. So focusing only on the money is not the solution. It's important, of course. As we like to say, farmers cannot be green if they are in red. And in order to uptake technology, for example, like precision farming technique, and all the new technological innovations in general, we need, at the beginning, some support from the institutions.
And you talked about, you were comparing with the olden days when, as you put it, the cheap option was the sexy option. So is, coming back to financial incentives and whether you have taxation, either higher taxes on some products than others or lower taxes as an incentive, do you think money, financial incentives are important here, Pablo? Or would you much more put the emphasis on the policy side as well?
Well, I think we have to be very honest, and I like the talk by Udo because he was very honest. I think farmers will produce the products you have presented this morning if there is a market for it, if they can earn money with it. At the moment we have the situation, and I won't look at him because I know how he will answer, is look at the number of small farmers you have alone in Germany, which is going down from year to year. They cannot survive with the pressure on them. And on the other side, we have consumers who want to have the best quality for the lowest price. Something is going wrong there. I don't have the answer. I'm a biochemist by training, so I'm a natural life scientist, so I don't know much about economics. But I think we have a problem there. And there is not one transition, because it's not only the transition here from one sort of crop to the other. We have to have in all this, from the farm to the fork chain, a whole number steps of transitions there, and we can't switch, or we cannot always put the pressure on the farmers and hoping that we will get high quality foods at the end of the chain. That does not work. It has not worked in the last years, and I think it hasn't got a future. That is the point. And I think, yes, what the project has shown in terms of sustaining biodiversity, sustaining the environment, I would 100% support those sort of sentences, but I think we have a number of problems which all of us know of, but we are not dealing them correctly at the moment.
And Carol, for you, I mean, we talk a lot in many policy areas about holistic approaches, joined up thinking, taking account of all the... it's easy to say, and it's never so easy to do. But we heard again and again this morning about the importance, and you've underlined it really, it has to be not just environmentally beneficial and sustainable, it has to be economically, we talked about farmers' incomes and so on, and social. Sustainability has many pillars, and making sure that as we accelerate this transition, we address all those issues. How do you as a policymaker do that in practice? And a comment from you as well on this balance between financial incentives and policy incentives, and our audience going much more with the policy than the financial, which will be music to your ears, because it means what you do matters.
Concerning a holistic approach, in our report on the development of plant proteins in the EU, we had 5 areas for further development. On the first one, we see the common agriculture policy as a clear enabler for increasing the plant protein production, because of, on the one side, the environmental benefits of nitrogen fixing, and also in crop rotation, the breaking of the pest cycles. So we see for both soil and water quality good opportunities to have the right incentives and measures in place. And also on the supply chain and and other market measures, we see also good opportunities in the common agriculture policy. For example, we will have sectoral programs to stimulate producer organizations so that farmers would cooperate together to be able to have that supply chain that the food sector is asking for. Of course, this for the member states to develop their national strategic CAP plans to incorporate plant proteins. But also this we also bring in line with research. We have several projects now in Horizon 2020. This project, for example, but also True or Lack Value, really focusing on the longer term view for the plant proteins, because it's the CAP more the short for the coming 7 years. Research is more for the next 15 years. And then also another line was that we want more market transparency. In our big market transparency initiative, we have included that we are going to collect more prices on pulses, because if you search for prices of those products, they are hardly available. So now for peas, beans, lentils and chickpeas, member states will have to supply every month prices, so that the farmer is better aware of what the potential of those crops is.
Going back to the point Udo was making this morning.
Yeah.
Joran, from your perspective, let me put it very simply. What do you want from these guys? As a company trying to really make headway in this area, and you talked about your ambitions for the future, in terms of a policy framework and an enabling environment that helps you most to do what you're trying to do and be part of that transition, what for you, are there any sort of clear do's and don'ts, if you like, for the policymakers? Things you want them to do and things you actively don't want them to do?
Yeah, for us, I think it's good that there's a good alternative to soy. Maybe soy is a good crop in many ways. We can do a lot with it. So yeah, it's good to see if there are other alternatives that can be as good as that, price-wise, but also in its functionality and things like that. And I think it's good to have a focus on that.
Would it be helpful, for example, or not, to have targets? We talked, and I mentioned when we talked about public sector procurement, and we said, well, you know, I gave an example to the room of something you might think about, a percentage of the food got through public procurement would have to be plant-based, or setting targets in terms of, you know, we've had the 5 a day for years and years as a target for people for fruit and veg, setting public health, official dietary. Is that sort of thing, do you think, helpful or not really?
I don't know if you really have to go that far. I think, yeah, people really have to be, have to see that the product is nice, and that stimulates, I think, them more to buy it the second time than really say you have to eat it.
Yeah. So let the market drive it. Don't try to be too artificial. Lots to come back to. I want to come back on the role of the CAP. I want to come back on the research and innovation agenda for the future, but I'm going to go out there first and just see if there are any questions or comments to what you've heard so far. She attempts to do that without breaking her neck again. Anybody have a question to our panel or indeed a comment? And sir, if you didn't manage to vote, if you want to share with us how you voted or would have voted if the technology hadn't let you down.
I can't remember the questions.
Don't worry.
Ross Campbell from Cyber College is a small contract research company in Ireland, founded by 4 Unilever managers. So interested to hear that you've just been taken over by Unilever. Maybe we'll have a chat over coffee. But the point I wanted to make was, we didn't raise it this morning, and we're talking here about value for the farmer. Yeah. In Ireland at the moment, we're having a situation where beef farmers are driving their tractors into Dublin and causing chaos because they're feeling screwed, because all the profit is in the meat processor. But then you look at the dairy industry, and 2 of the biggest dairies in the world are Irish, Kerry and Glanbia. And why is that? Because the processor is sharing the profit with the farmer. There are farming cooperatives in the Netherlands, the big successful Royal Kassoon Group, owned by farmers. So if you're going to change the protein game, you're going to have to set up protein processors who share the profit with the farmer. And we didn't talk about side streams from the isolates. I've been a stupid chemist for most of my working life. I'm a polysaccharide chemist. I went into nature, I extracted the polysaccharide, and I threw everything else away. Let's stop being wasteful. Let's think holistically. What's wrong with protein flour? Because it's got all the other stuff in it. So maybe less processed, but if you're going to get an isolate, let's look at what you're throwing away, because I can turn that into food fibre. So the only way we're going to do it is think holistically and share the profit with the farmer.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'll get a comment on that a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you. Milka Sokolovic again from UFIC. I would like to reflect on the couple of points made by Pablo Steinberg and maybe pose a challenge to everyone in the room. By the way, I voted on behavior change as a potential main driver, and I was actually thrilled to see that that was the majority of the vote. And Pablo mentioned that for that we need to up our game in communication and education, and I can't agree more. However, that won't drive the behavior change on its own. For behavior change, we need many other factors that will impact behavior change, including nudging, including incentives, including an environment that will make healthier and more sustainable choices easy choices. However, communication and education is the first and crucial step in behavior change. Now there I would like to make a point on communication being our joint responsibility. So far we see communication as a job of communicators or media, but I would state that each one of us, stakeholders in this room, have a role to play in communicating about healthy and sustainable diets. And that holds for scientists themselves to translate their work into human. That holds for media to ensure accurate reporting. That holds for the NGOs to create a level playing field. Okay. That, are you shutting me down?
Okay. Yeah, I have to be brief. I'm afraid we can't do long speeches.
I'm getting there. Okay, so my point would be, if we want people to be aware of healthier and more sustainable choices, we need to up our communication game altogether, and we need aligned and clear messages across the sector.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Lots to come back to in our conversation. Thank you again, sir.
My name is Henk Westhoek from Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I also voted for the consumer track for change, but following up on the comment just made, I wonder, because we believe as an institute that it's not the consumer doing independently, making his or her choice, but that the whole choice is framed by the environment people are living in, by the culture people are living in. So what could be the role of retailers, restaurants, caterers, etc., in helping consumers to make the healthy and sustainable choice?
Thank you very much. Coming back to that, the responsibility to communicate this does not communicate and provide those nudges. Yes. How do they, what role do they play? Any other comments or questions at this stage? I will give you another opportunity a bit later on if I can, but Udo, please. No, I wanted you to join in again. I encouraged it, so.
Yes, Udo Prince, seen me before. First of all, comment on the person from, I think was from hydrocolloids, or cybercolloids, yes. Who had been spending his life doing stuff with polysaccharides and chucking away the rest, especially in the business of protein crops and, for instance, lupins. It's the protein that is being used and the polysaccharides being chucked away. So maybe you should talk. Because they have a hard time getting a good value for the polysaccharides.
We're looking at packaging sunflower
Okay, but the polysaccharides of lupins are superior, of course.
Okay, yeah.
One question that I had is because earlier on there were several talks on that. Yes, we're focusing, especially in protein food as well, into highly processed foods and doing all the isolation stuff and then making very sexy kind of products from it. At the other hand, we have several talks that we should try and stimulate the eating of just whole pulses more and more. But then, how do we get them sexy and how do we get them to the consumers? Because the best way and the most healthy way to consume pulses is to eat them whole. Because if you only use the protein, you only use half of the healthy stuff. Most of the grants into research and development of new systems are targeted at sexy stuff. It's making very sexy and good meat-like substances because there's a lot of technology involved. But I would plead, or maybe see if it is possible, to get more funding into the less sexy use of pulses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Come back on sexiness or otherwise in a moment. Any other burning comments? I see one at the back here, and then panel, I'll come back to give you a chance to respond on all these different points. Thank you, madam.
Yeah, thank you. Just as a response to...
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Jutta Dirkes from the University of Bergen in Norway. Just a response to Udo right now. I think actually we also need a clear message on the consumption of pulses. I mean, we have this message on 5 a day fruit and vegetables. Why not a message like pulses 3 times a week or 2 times a week or whatever for the warm meal?
Thank you very much indeed. So a lot of these comments and questions all centering around the consumer and the thing that most of you identified as the most important driver, that choice and behavior. There was a point made about, we need, Pablo, we need the education, you highlighted that, but we need more than that. It's not going to do it on its own. We need the nudges. Goes back to the incentives question.
Well, I think the first point made by the colleague from UFIC, I can only sign that. As a scientist, I would say most of us are very bad communicators. If a journalist or a TV channel rings up, most of my colleagues would go behind the next door hoping that the question doesn't come to them. I think that is one thing that in modern science we have to learn. If we as scientists have a position, we have to communicate it. And we have to take a microphone or in front of a camera and say what we have to say. Most of us do not do that nowadays in Germany. I know that as a toxicologist many times a very...
Hang on. I'll come back to you afterwards. Sorry, she was interrupting. Keep going.
No, that's the point about communication. And what Udo says, I can only also subscribe. How to do it more sexy, I haven't got the answer to that. But I would like to make a controversial point when I hear about alternative to meat and meat analogs. As a toxicologist, I am very interested always in the ingredients that are added to the product in order to make a meat analog look like meat and taste like meat. And I'm not very fond of many food additives that are being included in this product.
Okay, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, Jorian, and also on this broad question of... No, but also on this, and then linked to that then, the broader question of how you appeal to the consumer. Do you do it on the basis of healthier choices? Do you do it on the basis of more sustainable choices for the environment? I mean, how do you communicate? What's your strategy for communicating? But please do pick up on the point that Pablo just made.
Yeah, our drive is really to make, to make for the consumer a good alternative for meat. So on that basis, we try now a lot of ingredients to get it done. It might be that there are too much, but we see the ones we put in now are really ones which have a function. So in our perspective they are needed, but we are always looking to see if we can decrease that more, because we also think the lesser the better. So yeah, I agree on that.
And in terms of your strategy for communicating with consumers, do you do it on very firmly on the health front, on the environmental sustainability? What's the thrust of the way you try to persuade consumers to buy and eat your products?
Our products are not really advocated a lot with extra proteins or things like that. It's really the whole choice, let's say, is more sustainable.
Yeah.
So yeah, not.
You focus on that broad sustainability
yeah.
message.
Yeah.
And can I just ask? There was a question about or a point about the role of retailers in all of this. So as a food manufacturer, how do you see the role of retailers both in educating consumers but also in providing the nudges and incentives for them to switch products?
I think there is a role for them to help them to make the better choice. So also educate them a little bit about why it would be better. And I think that maybe goes hand in hand also with what researchers are doing. So maybe we can have a platform with researchers together with industry and smart marketeers to get the message across to the consumers.
Just sticking with this consumer point for a moment, Ricardo, from your perspective and the role of farmers in this, I mean, do you see a direct role for farmers? There was a talk earlier about this sort of idea of getting back to how we were and whether that was a good strategy, back to the land, back to the way we used to be, back to more natural, locally produced products. Do you think that is part of the answer to this debate, or do you think really the communication challenge is more for those further down the chain?
I think going back just for the sake of going back is a regression, not progress.
So it doesn't work as a message?
No. We should analyze what was working in the past, and we should integrate in the further developments. So we have to, if there were some practices, for example, which were very good for environmental sustainability or to improve the quality of crops, of the soil, of the meat products, we should take them into account in case we forgot about them. But we cannot believe that the agriculture has to go back to the way it was pictured 50, 60 years ago. Because nowadays, unfortunately, as it was highlighted, having a small farm is difficult for the economic sustainability. There are a lot of attacks out there in the Brussels bubble, for example, against the current agricultural model. But this is economically sustainable also. We have to take this into account. the picture of the small farmer, that we also represent small
Indeed.
farmers, and they have quite big issues currently.
And the role of the farmers in this communications effort?
We are trying to communicate as much as possible. I think it's very good that, for example, nowadays farmers are opening their farms to the people, so to the citizens and consumers, so they can really see the reality of the narrative inside the farms for crop production, for livestock production, and we should foster also short supply chains, not necessarily local. Local is just one aspect of the short supply chain. I think it's quite difficult to go local in the north of Finland, for example.
But that opening up farms, I mean, it reminds me of, I think it was in the 1960s, the BBC did an April Fool about spaghetti growing on trees. And they showed pictures of the spaghetti harvest and people picking spaghetti, and everyone thought it was very funny. Now, you'd probably get a lot of young kids going, I always wondered where spaghetti came from, and believing it entirely. So, question about that, is that an important tool? But Carol, from your perspective on this consumer issue, and the suggestion here, the education, the getting them early, really important. But then the nudge, we need those, it's not going to do it on its own. What do you believe the key is to unlocking this consumer behaviour? And is it to talk about the sustainability message, or is it just to make it cheap, easy, and that comes back to the conversation about pricing signals and internalising external costs? What drives it? Making it accessible, affordable and attractive, or telling them it's good for them, or what works?
It is not my specialty, but I don't think telling them that it is better for the environment or healthier, it is really running them to the shelf for getting more pulses or more meat alternatives. What Jorien was saying, the taste, it really starts with the taste. People have to like the product. If it is sustainable, maybe they try it one time, but if it doesn't taste, you're not going to buy it the second time.
So that, when Emanuele talked in the first session this morning about, for him, the big challenge ahead was to make sure when you get those trade-offs, taste, colour, look, smell, getting that right is absolutely, in the end, you have to make it something people want to buy and want to eat, but coupled with that education.
I think that's the most important point. We've been working in the Institute on pea flour and making, for example, pasta out of it. Please don't put that in front of me because I won't eat it. I have tasted that and it's horrible. So don't try to convince me. I'm a carnivore. So you have to go. I think that, and that I missed this morning because of the short time the colleagues had. But at the end, the sensory properties of the products you are going to develop will decide if there is a market for it or not. Because I think you can only convince them of that if, for example, the Impossible Burger has been a step forward, even if I don't push that forward, but is a step forward because if you look at the text, you look at the texture and you look at the taste, they have done huge improvements in that respect. But in general, leaving away the burgers, all these products with these new crops will come in the market. They may be a market at the moment, a niche for those people with a higher education, having a sense for ethical questions, but for the mass of the people, they are not the answer if they don't taste so that they are being bought. I think that's in the end will decide, and that will decide if the farmers will go for these new crops at the end of the day.
Okay, I want to come back to the farmers now, if I might, Ricardo. And Carol, when talking about the challenge at the beginning, talked about the role of the CAP as an enabler in this area. We've heard talk about the importance of producer organisations to try and really, and farming cooperatives to both make those links in the value chain, but also, as was put by our colleague from Ireland, that sharing of the profits between the processors and the farmers and so on. Just in terms of how you see the role of the CAP here and whether it's doing enough to contribute to this transition, and where the trends are in terms of producer organizations and cooperatives, if you would?
Well, I think that the CAP is what in Europe is guaranteeing the basis for food security. This is for sure. It was developed after the Second World War to try to guarantee the food security. Of course, there are some economic problems for some sectors of the population, as I was mentioning before, that cannot buy all the nutritious food that they need. But without the CAP, we will be in a very worse condition.
But is it also driving the sorts of transformations that we need effectively, do you think?
Well, the CAP can be a driver, and of course, if the policy makers will tailor the CAP for certain needs, we will follow the CAP. That's for sure.
So it can be important as a driver. And in terms of farming cooperatives in this area, are we seeing the development of new producer organizations in response to these trends, or what's happening on the ground? And how important is this for your members,
Yes.
this sharing of the... If they're not going to gain, they're not going to do the primary production. So how do we get that right?
I'm in a very lucky position to represent both the farmers and the agri-cooperatives, because Copa and Cogeca represent both.
So.
We represent the 22 million farmers and their family members and 23,000 cooperatives. And I have to say that really the agri-cooperatives provide the best opportunities for farmers to get the added value from the food chain. So of course we promote as much as possible the creation of agri-cooperatives, because they can really, if I can use this word, compete also with the food industry in order to create products which are very good for consumers, even a little transformed, a bit transformed, not ultra-processed food, but still processed food, like cheese production, for example. And thanks to the agri-cooperatives, many farmers managed to survive economic crisis.
Jorian, in terms of the work, the way your relationship with the farmers, how does that work? Are the sorts of issues we're talking about here, do they form part of the conversation between you and your suppliers? How well is that supply chain cooperation working?
I'm not really aware between the conversation from the farmer to the suppliers. We talk to our suppliers and see what's available, but the farmer to the supplier, I don't know.
Not so much. But Carol, I mean, how important do you believe, we talked about producer organizations, cooperatives, all of these things, how important are they to realize all this potential and this supply chain cooperation?
I think it is quite important, and also DG Agri thinks it is important. That's why in the future CAP we really try to stimulate more development of producer organizations, and also for the protein sector it will be possible to develop sectoral programs for producer organizations.
Is that something that is in the pipeline?
Yes, it is.
It is.
And last year also we had a workshop on supply chains, and there was a producer of soy drinks, and they purchase all their the vast majority of their soybeans from cooperatives. So because they work with whom they have long-term relationship to have the right and stable quality they need for their production, and it also guarantees farmers that they have an outlet. And also, it was I think also mentioned earlier this morning, it takes for farmers also a couple of years to get, if they start a new crop, to get to the yields that it is really profitable.
I wanted to ask you also about, in terms of Horizon Europe, the new research and innovation program, and priorities there. It was a question I asked this morning, and you touched on it earlier, Carol, in your answer to my first question. But let's go out to the room one more time and see if there are any comments or questions from them, and then we'll turn to that issue and try to identify some priorities for action. Just to give you that warning, I'm going to put you on the spot as I did our panel this morning. Anybody have a thought, question, comment to what you are hearing, or indeed an experience to share? Or are you just enjoying listening to them talk? Yes, let me pass. Can you reach across? Thanks a lot. And then I come there.
Hello, my name is Steve Gilman. I'm from IHS Market, which used to be Agri-Europe, so I'm the main journalist there. And I'm just curious what policies you'd like to see in the European Green Deal and the farm-to-fork strategy that can really drive ahead everything that you've been talking about, whether it's from nudging the consumer to eat more sustainable proteins, or even in strategic plans for farmers to really adopt more sustainable protein.
Thank you for setting that broader context of the Green Deal and all the talk around that at the moment to frame our charting of the way forward. Thank you very much.
Hi, Marta Vasconcelos from Catholic University of Portugal. I just wanted to make a comment that I totally agree that we need to start young and start educating children about pulses and plant proteins. But I also think we need to be aware that parents are also major blockers for these innovations. I'll give you a practical example. In Porto, they decided to introduce a vegetarian meal in public schools. And they did this in 2 different schools. In one school, they warned the parents they were going to do this. In the other school, they did not warn the parents. In the school where the parents had not been warned, the transition was easy. Children started eating vegetarian once per week, no problem. When they did warn the parents this was going to happen, there was a riot. And the move was blocked. The municipality could not do the change. So we need to also educate parents. That's just my comment.
A great lesson in how it can go wrong if you sound nanny state, if you sound like you're, which really goes back to what you're all saying about making these positive choices, not negative choices. Fascinating example there. Where was that? I didn't promise behind. Please, Andreas. Okay, I thought I'd promised one behind.
Andreas again. Besides education, Pablo, you mentioned affordability is an important point. My question doesn't go only to you, but to all others. What would be the solution? Is meat too cheap? Would plant-based foods need a type of subsidy to be cheaper? Or do we need a minimum wage across Europe?
Oh, goodness me. Hang on, let's, can we have a second day for this event? Because we're now opening up a whole hornet's nest. But, yes. Come down, right down the middle here. Meet me halfway. Go on, Emmanuel.
Just a quick, let's say, observation regarding the point that Udo stressed before regarding the use or consume the whole legumes and raw grain, and so that's less processed possible. We have to keep in mind that basically this, let's say, consumption is not fitting all the consumers, because people basically have factoring with IBS, so it's around 20% of the population cannot actually process legumes due to the high content of oligosaccharides. So, I like the message, to get back to the roots, so consume as the raw ingredients much more. But I will also stress the point that basic processing is also the way that basically facilitate the consumer transition in the last 20 years. So processing doesn't mean also bad things. It also means that basically we can shape our products, our food, in terms of what we need, or what are our, let's say, medical indication as well. So just to point out this and stress that.
So we need a more nuanced, a more sophisticated approach, if you like. There isn't going to be somebody said this morning, I think it was Nick, no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet here either, and we need to be aware of that. As I make my way back, any last questions or comments? Speak now, or not forever, but for now, hold your peace. Okay, broad question there, really a lot of comments, but one very specific question about affordability. Is it about meat's too cheap, or we need to make this, whatever? And this broader question about the European Green Deal. And perhaps, Carol, you could help us by saying a word about how you see this discussion in the context of the European Green Deal. Let's start with that.
Yeah, of course, the Green Deal is now being developed. It will be published in spring this year, and it will be much more from of the green. Sorry, that was the farm to fork. The Green Deal is the broad context of the climate and environmental objectives, and it counts for everybody. So also for the farmers. And I think that farmers are also a part of the solution. They can make some measures to reduce emissions and things like that. And one part of that Green Deal is, of course, the farm to fork, which will be published and which will create good opportunities for more sustainable production by European farmers. It will not say that in the whole of Europe we should have faba beans. That is not the solution. In different regions of Europe, different pulses will grow better. So you have to adjust to local circumstances. And I think the pulses and also soya can really contribute to some environmental and climate goals.
Ricardo, representing the farmers, what do you hope for in terms specifically the farm to fork element of the Green Deal?
Well, I will say that the farm to fork is focusing on some aspects. For example, they mentioned the reduction of pesticides or the fertilizers and also veterinary products. But it's important to take into account that if we have crop losses because we reduce too much the pesticides, we are pushing too much on the environmental sustainability, and we are destroying the economic sustainability. At the same time, Europe is more and more invaded by food products produced by crops, for example, or also meat products produced outside the European Union with standards much lower than what we have here. So for us, it's more and more difficult to also understand this philosophy maybe behind the farm to fork, which is, in theory, it's a very good opportunity. But in practice, it has to be a solution for the European agriculture. Shouldn't create additional problems, because if we have a more and more expensive farming methodologies, for example, because we haven't pesticides, we have no breeding techniques, we have no veterinary products and so on, but people in South America are producing very cheap products because they can use whatever they want. This is not fair.
But that brings us back to the other question I wanted to talk about research and innovation. And where we need to focus. And you mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned new breeding techniques, you're mentioning again here now, we're talking about the reduced use of pesticides, and that's one area where the research suggests that's been done by the project, that actually in terms of fertilizers, in terms of pesticides, protein plants can make a big difference and can help. So there's a whole thing. But in terms of as we look to Horizon Europe, we see whether we get this doubling of the agri-food budget or not. The whole of the new budget is under pressure. But in terms of the same question I really asked this morning's panel, where we need to focus now, the research and innovation effort, where do you think it needs to be? Is it building more projects of this type? Is it other areas you would focus on? Pablo, where would you focus?
I think if we thought of a continuation or a further development of the project we saw this morning, we're on the right way if we understand which are the open questions which we have. The question or the point that was made by the colleague just from Portugal only a few minutes ago shows, I think still, that the issue of consumer behavior, parent and children and parents together or separated, doesn't matter. That's an important issue, and the point how you communicate that That is, I think, extremely important. And the other point is, if you want to convince consumers of having basically a vegetarian diet supplemented with a certain amount of meat, then you will have to convince them what are the advantages of this thing. And I'm working at an institute where we're looking naturally at the health aspects of food and nutrition. And there I would say, for a continuation or a second or a third or a fourth project working on that, you will have to work out which are the human health aspects which make these crops or new crops that will come into the market attractive, more attractive for the consumer.
And then how we need more science about what communication works, as if I understand you right.
Not only that, but also really, I think we have a lot of animal studies on the effects of diet constituents. But if you look at the evidence in humans, then that evidence is really not that strong all the day. And one of the things we have in the nutritional science community is you have a number of very bad studies out there which are not worth the paper they have been printed on. And that is very difficult for a consumer reading a newspaper which is dealing with these studies to know what is really true and what is not true. That is a very important point in the time we're living with a lot of fake news. For example, we've had a long discussion on milk. You will be surprised, but there are, I would name them still scientists, I'd be diplomatic, saying that milk is almost a poison. And I think that is very difficult to contradict in a time where people are online all the time and don't know what is being said is really true or not. And there again we come to the role of each of us as scientists, which are scientists in the auditorium, to really take a position. And that is in nutritional science. Nutrition is a subject. We've got in Germany 80 million nutrition specialists. Everyone has at least one, at the best 2 opinions. And that is very difficult when you are a policymaker or you are a scientist to get through with the truth.
In terms of research innovation and publicly funded, obviously you as a company are developing products, doing your own, and as you say, now you're part of a bigger company, more bang for your bucks, more bucks to play with in terms of the research side of it. But in terms of public money and things that as an industry as a whole, as distinct from one company, where do you think, does the support need to be in terms of taking things to market? We've had a lot more emphasis in recent years in the EU, not just on the research, but turning that into innovative products, getting those products to market. Where should the focus be, do you think, for public research funding?
I think the focus should really be on trying to get the products better tasting, so really focus on that part. Besides that, I think we also should look which kind of ingredients we use. It might be, what you say, we cannot directly use pulses to make meat alternative, which will not taste like meat, but maybe we can end up somewhere in the middle, looking more for technological driven flours, for example. So looking what do we need and try to achieve that instead of trying to achieve an isolate which contains a lot of proteins. So I would really see what is needed and try to see if you can get it as sustainable as possible.
Any other thoughts on research and innovation priorities for the next period? Carol?
I think because the pulses are minor crops, they are not really picked up by the big breeding companies, so development has been lagging behind. So I think still breeding in more stable stable yields and higher yields is important, but also breeding towards that you have the nutritional needs for the food processors. I think there is an important topic, but also better understanding of the supply chains and the life cycle analysis. It is
those areas.
it really needs a broad scope of research.
Sure. And for you, Ricardo, any particular priorities from the research side?
I will say 3 priorities. First of all, to include more and more farmers in the research projects, because there may be a misalignment between what the academia is delivering and what is actually useful for farmers sometimes. So it's good to include our category of stakeholders within the European projects. And we should develop for the pulses plant protection products for minor uses, which is very important, because not necessarily a company is willing to invest in a new plant protection product unless there is a market. If the market is too small, then there is no product, we can't protect them. And for the animal health, we should boost much more the vaccination. So prevention, which is very important, as we also see with African swine fever, for example.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are almost out of time, and I want to just, we talked there specifically about priorities in research, but more broadly, if for each of you, it's the same question really I asked the first panel, and I start at this end with my first question, so I'll start at that end with my last one. If we are to continue this pioneering work, pioneering crops for future generations, is the slogan for Protein to Food. If we are to ensure that we build on the work that's been done, that we really are pioneering, that your company achieves its ambitions for the future, what is the key next step, the one thing you would highlight more than anything else we need to do now? It can be from an industry perspective, a policy perspective, an educationalist perspective, but how are we going to create the best possible environment to accelerate this transition in our food systems more broadly, and the protein transition we've been talking about today? Jorian.
I would say, what I said before, actually, I think the best way is to make a product which is as tasteful as possible, because the consumer is willing to buy that and buy that more often. So I would have a look to a crop which is sustainable, that we all know, but for the consumer it should be the best possible product.
So going back to what Pablo said at the beginning about, we were talking about when the cheap option was the sexiest, when the yummiest option is also the best, the tastiest. Carol, your key priority for yourself or someone else on the panel, or for the wider world?
I think the key priority is that sustainable value chain, where all the actors in the value chain can earn a decent coin for growing the pulses.
It's got to be something in it for everyone, or they won't do it. Ricardo.
Well, I will say that we need to have a balanced narrative. So we shouldn't blame some sectors just to promote our products. This is the worst way of communicating, I think. As human beings, we need a balanced diet, and we will need all the products available out there, both animal and plants. We represent both plant and animal producers, and so I will say that we don't necessarily need to blame animal proteins in order to promote plant proteins.
So focus on positive messages, not negatives and trading one product off against another. Pablo, you have the last word.
Well, as an institute with 600 to 700 people working for the German government in the area of food and nutrition, I can tell you one of the most important programs which we have been working on and we will expand is on alternative proteins. Why? Because there is a pressure of the society on the German government, on the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture into this issue. It's insects, it's these new sort of crops, and this is a subject which is on the political agenda. And that's why I would say that is the subject in the next 5 to 10 years to cope with.
And keep it up there on the political agenda, also very important. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed? Thank you so much. You may return to the